um, presentation and introduce Roger Chao, who is the co-host today. He is a member of the board of directors of Oakland Literacy, and he's also an assistant professor of writing and rhetoric at Oakland University. And he has a special affinity for the work that we do here at Oakland Literacy. He came to the United States from China as a young boy with his parents, and both of his parents had the benefit of working with tutors to improve their English. So he believes strongly in the work that we do, and he's been helping us specifically in the area of working with employers who want to improve the writing skills of their workforce. So he's helping to pursue that venture that we have going. But I've asked him here today to give you some tips on working with students in their writing, since even though we're working remotely, there's lots of tools we have that we can use to encourage our students to use their writing skills, and that's another way that they can just become more proficient in English. So I'm going to mute everybody. I'm sure there will be times when, well, I'll let Roger talk about how he's going to let you guys ask questions, and then I will turn things over to him.
All right, thanks for the great intro, Lori. Appreciate that. Before we start, I just wanted to point something out. So if you, I don't know who here is unfamiliar with Zoom, or maybe this is your first time using Zoom, but there's a chat function in Zoom. So right at the bottom of, if you see on your screen, there's all of our screens here. At the bottom of it, there's a little button called chat. And so if you have questions while your mic is muted that you really want to ask, you can type it into the chat, and I'll read that later on. I'll also have a good chunk of time at the end of the workshop, and I'm also going to build some in between the workshop that will give people a chance to ask questions. But but if you can't hear me, if you can't see something, there's no way for you to get that across. Just type it into the chat function, and I'll be able to see that. Okay. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to go ahead and just share my PowerPoint presentation with you. So you're going to see some movement happening on your screen. Don't panic. You're not doing anything wrong. So it's just something that I'm setting up on my end. Okay. All right. So let me get this set up here. Okay. So everyone should see a PowerPoint, right?
Yep.
Does that look good? Okay, great. All right. So welcome to the workshop. So today we're going to focus on specifically helping our students write. And before we get into this, I just want to kind of build off a little bit on what Lori was saying in the intro, which is that, first off, thank you for taking this time out of your day to do this. And you guys are all doing really valuable work. One of the things that Lori had mentioned is that, my parents immigrated to this country from China in the 90s, and they really sought out the help of literacy programs just like this one to learn English. And this one, I always tell this one anecdote, so some of you might have already heard it, but my dad has the worst memory. Like, I feel like he never remembers anything. My mom will tell him something and he'll forget it instantly, but he to this day still remembers the name of the woman that helped him, his tutor. Her name was Lucy. And so it just shows, I think, the profound impact that you all are having on your students, even if they might not be showing it now, or they might not be telling you, they find it valuable. And so definitely keep doing the work that you guys are all doing. So today in our workshop, let me get this PowerPoint started. I want to cover a couple of main areas, right? So first, I just want to talk a little bit about why is writing so important to literacy education, and why is it valuable? We're also going to talk about how to maybe set up a writing journal or a log to get our students to constantly practice their writing, even if it's just a couple sentences a day, even if it's something short. Writing prompts, okay? What is a writing prompt? Why are they valuable? And I also have tips on, I have a link for you guys to check out if you are interested in just drawing. It's like an archive of writing prompts that you guys can use. And I also have some instructions on if you are interested in creating your own writing prompts for your students, maybe something a little bit more specific to your students' needs and things like that, I'll have a little bit of details on how to do that. And then a couple details on how to give feedback on student writing. So what are some things that we should be doing when we are presented with our student writing? What should we say in response? And then finally, I just want to run through a sample writing activity for an online tutoring session. So this quarantine and the fact that everything is now online is making tutoring a little bit complicated because, as you know, there's not that face-to-face engagement. And in my opinion, literacy is something that is learned much better when we are in the proximity of our students. So how do we sort of get around this if we are forced to teach online? So I have an example of an activity that we could do that will get our students to practice writing and that we can maybe give them some feedback on, okay? So why is writing an important part of literacy? I won't spend too much time on this, but here is just some sort of, I think, important concepts to keep in mind and some things to remember, right? So simply put, reading and speaking only account for a part of being literate. And there are many language learners out there who are competent speakers and listeners, but struggle mightily when it comes to writing. And just as an anecdote, right? So I was talking about my parents earlier. They've been in this country for decades now. And, their English is, they still speak with an accent and things like that, but they can get through the daily interactions, right? Like going to the bank, going to the grocery store. My parents are actually in the process of closing on a condo that they just bought, right? So they have the speaking and the listening ability to do some of this work. But I remember just, I think 2 years ago, my mom, who works in a dentist's office, had to write sort of this self-evaluation. So it was like the end of the work year. Her boss asked her to write up a self-evaluation. Like, how do you think you did this year as an employee? And she couldn't do it. She did not know how to start writing this, even though she had been in the US for decades. She can buy groceries. She can do all the things that require reading and speaking. But when it came to writing, it was literally impossible for her. And so that's when I realized how important writing was and how big of a chunk of our literacy it actually takes up. So, even though reading and speaking are a big part of being literate, writing is this really crucial component of our day-to-day communication. And even short emails that we write or short things that we write are very, very important, right? So imagine an email that you're trying to send to your doctor, or maybe an email you're trying to send to your lawyer. Emails sometimes are just a couple of sentences, but the information that's in them is vitally important. So we want to make sure that our students can write well. And then writing also teaches us how to form an argument. How do we support it with details and evidence? And then how do you present that argument in a clear and organized manner? I always tell my students, the things that you struggle with writing isn't necessarily always what do I say, but how do I organize all this stuff that's in my head? So that's some of the things why writing is important. Okay, so because of all these details, writing can feel really challenging because unlike speaking or listening, the interaction between two people does not occur in real time. Therefore, there are fewer opportunities to correct yourself or ask for clarification during the act of communicating. Okay, so think about a conversation that you're having with someone. If they don't understand something that you said, they can right there in that moment say, oh, can you repeat that? Or what do you mean? Or maybe you're having a conversation with someone and you realize you've misspoke and you say, oh, no, what I meant to say was this. Well, we don't get those opportunities necessarily when we write. When we, let's say, write an email and it's full of grammar mistakes, we fire that email off. That's it. The person receives an email full of errors, right? And in that moment, they'll have an impression of you, or they'll think something of you, right? So we don't get to really correct ourselves in real time when it comes to writing. And because of this, many people, and not just language learners, are very nervous about writing because it leaves us feeling very exposed. So when people say, I don't like to write, or I don't like writing, I think one of the main reasons is because it shows or reveals our thought process, right? And so if our writing is sloppy, if our writing is messy, we're afraid that it shows that, we can't think clearly, or we can't think in a straightforward way. And so because of this, people shy away from writing. And if your student is nervous about writing, let them know the only way to get practice, or the only way to get better, is through practice. Okay. Writing is something that takes a long time to develop. It's not, that's just the unfortunate case of it. And so the one thing to take away from this whole workshop, I think, is that this writing is not something that you need to necessarily rush your student through. And if you notice that your student's writing is progressing much slower than their speaking or listening, that's completely natural. It's just the process of writing is just very difficult, regardless of the language that you do it in. So just take your time with your students' writing. Okay. So one of the key ways to practice writing, and some of you may already do this, so I apologize if I'm repeating information that you already know, but is to ask them to keep a writing journal. So this is something I do even with my college students. I teach first year college students all the way up to seniors who are about to graduate. And for every class I teach, all my students keep a writing journal. Okay. A writing journal is a low stakes approach to improving writing. So, in these writing journals, I'll have students write their responses to a question I ask. I'll have students use their writing journal to brainstorm ideas even before we talk, right? So even if it's a conversation-based activity, I'll still have students just use the writing journal to help them jot some ideas down. So it's a very valuable tool to learn writing. So the purpose of a writing journal is so that your student can practice their writing during every tutoring session, even if it's just a few sentences or paragraphs. Any practice is better than no practice. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Obviously, your students are all at different ranges and different skill levels. So, the writing that they'll be doing are going to vary in a great range. You'll have some students that, they can write at most 3 sentences and then they're sort of cognitively done. Or you might have a student who can push out 1 to 2 paragraphs. Whatever it is, a writing journal is perfect for that because it just gives them a chance to practice whatever level that they are at. Okay. However, as a tutor, it's also important that your student is not just writing, but that you're also giving them feedback on their writing. So that means you should be consistently reading your students' journal. So we'll talk a little bit about the kind of different formats of journals, but that's just something to keep in mind, is that the writing journal isn't just for your student, but it's also for you to sort of help track and monitor their growth. I want to, as an aside, I'll just talk about a study I remember reading about in graduate school, which this researcher followed a Japanese gentleman who grew up in Japan and moved to Hawaii, and what he noticed was this gentleman, despite spending decades and decades of years in the U.S., his language, his pronunciation, his language proficiency was still very basic and very limited. And what the researcher realized was that in the environment that this gentleman was in, his language is good enough to get him through his daily interactions, but no one around him was ever correcting his grammar, or no one was ever correcting his English, right? And so he just went through years and years and years and had competent language skills, but definitely not a grasp on the core elements of English. And so that just shows you how valuable feedback is, that your student isn't just writing in their journal, but that you're also able to point out, like, here's an error, or be sure to watch out for this, okay? I'll share this PowerPoint in a moment, but let's see, actually, I'll talk about the second PowerPoint first. Sorry. So journals can be kept in an electronic format. So if you are familiar or you're comfortable with technology, you can create a journal with a Google Doc or a Microsoft Word document. And there's a great tutorial on YouTube about how to create a Google Doc and share it between 2 people if you are unfamiliar with that process. So I'll share this PowerPoint later and you can follow this link. But watching this tutorial is very straightforward. And it's a pretty easy process. However, you can also just go with a traditional notebook for a writing journal. And I think that once a lot of the quarantine barriers have been uplifted and we are able to meet our students in person once again, you may think about just going with a traditional notebook so that it's just easier for everyone involved. Okay. If you do decide to keep a writing journal with a Google Doc or Microsoft Word, just remember that Google Doc and Microsoft Word has a feature that identifies misspelled word and simple syntax issues. right? So if you ever use Microsoft Word and you spell something wrong on it, Microsoft Word will draw this like little red squiggle underneath your misspelled word, and that lets you know that word is misspelled. And this can be both a good or bad thing, depending how you look at it. So if your student, maybe you want them to focus more on the structure of a sentence, making sure everything's in order, then Google Doc and Microsoft Word is great because they don't have to focus on making sure everything is spelled correctly. Microsoft Word will just point it out for them. However, if your student is still at a level where you want to make sure that they're practicing spelling things correctly and they're remembering those things, then you might want to avoid Microsoft Word, because otherwise they can always just see exactly like, oh, this is misspelled, and then they just click it and it automatically corrects itself. So if your student is still at a level where you want them to remember what words, what the correct spelling of certain words are, Microsoft Word is something that you might want to avoid because you want them to practice remembering how a word looks. Okay, so at this stage of the PowerPoint, do we have any questions? And Lori, if you want to unmute the mics. No, pretty good. Okay, great. If you do have questions, like I said, you can type it either in the chat or just save it for the Q&A at the end. Okay, so writing prompts. Writing prompts are meant to make a writing task easier. Sometimes there is nothing more challenging than looking at a blank screen or a piece of paper and trying to figure out what you want to write. Okay, so writing prompt, for those who are unfamiliar, is just a set of instructions that you give your students for a writing task. And they're meant to sort of help stimulate and get the ball rolling. If you're like me, you definitely have those experiences, especially during school, where you're just sitting there and you're staring at a screen or you're staring at a piece of paper and you're like, what? Like, I don't know what to say. I don't know what the first thing to put down is. And so writing prompts are meant to help you get over that hump. Okay, so an effective writing prompt gives your student a target to aim for in their writing. So that's how I always think about writing prompts. It's a goal, right? So that your student isn't just racking their brain trying to think about what they want to write, but they have an idea of what they want to do. Okay, so this website that I'll provide, it provides a writing prompt for every day of the year. It's a really great resource, and it's literally, and they range from different levels. So some for very basic writers, some for a bit more advanced. So this link is very helpful. However, like I said, they might not be all applicable to your students' literacy ability. You'll probably have to scan through the prompts yourself and figure out which ones will work well for your student. Okay, so like I said, if you borrow a writing prompt or writing prompts from this website, you may have to modify or edit the prompts a little bit before assigning one to your student. Okay, so this is a great resource if you're not comfortable yet with creating your own writing prompt. This is like an archive of material for you. All right. So if you are interested in however, in creating your own writing prompts, I just want to give you a couple tips in mind. And this is actually what I recommend, because you know your students best, right? You know what their skills are, you know the context they come from. And so if you can come up with your own writing prompts, it might feel a little bit more personal to your student, which might get them to engage with you a little bit more. Okay, so some things to keep in mind as you are coming up with your own writing prompt. There are two main types of writing prompts. Right? Prompts that ask your students to be descriptive, and then prompts that ask your students to be reflective. And I'll explain what those two mean. Right? Descriptive prompts ask for writing that describes or recounts a situation or event. Okay, so this is meant to be something very straightforward, right? So a prompt, a descriptive writing prompt would be something very simple, like when you go grocery shopping, what do you usually buy? Okay, and in a situation like this, you're expecting your students to just kind of describe to you what they do. So when I go grocery shopping, I buy apples, oranges, and bread. Sometimes I buy this. Okay, so you're not asking for anything else. You want to see that your students can just, you want to see their observational abilities. You want to see their descriptive abilities. Reflective prompts, on the other hand, ask for writing that requires explanation of thought or analysis. And so an example would be, if you can visit any country for vacation, where would you go and why? Okay, so reflective prompts do not just stop at describing, but it pushes your students to think a little bit past to explain why, right? And so here, if you can visit any country, where would you go and why? If your student just says, if I can go to any country, I would go to Japan, and then they stop there, then you need to push them a little bit more, okay? So the why part of this is what makes this a reflective prompt. So depending on your student's ability, you may have to determine, okay, are they more suited for just descriptive writing prompts right now, or can they handle a reflective prompt? Okay, can they only kind of just describe what they see, or is their literacy at a point where they can tell me their thought process and things like that? Now, you can definitely mix the two types of the prompts together. So here's an example, right? Tell me about your favorite meal to eat. What are the ingredients? And why is this meal your favorite? Okay, and so the what are the ingredients part will get your student to practice the description part. And then the why is this meal your favorite gets them to practice the reflective part. Okay, so you can definitely mix these two types of prompts together. Right. Some other things to keep in mind. Writing prompts should be straight to the point. Do not get too wordy or add too many details. Otherwise, your student will be confused by what the prompt is asking. And this is something that I always still have to catch myself on, because when I'm writing prompts or assignment prompts for my students, I put too many details in there, and I read it back to myself later on, and I'm like, I don't even know what I'm asking, right? So you want to make sure your prompts are straight to the point. Okay. I also recommend that you avoid prompts that require your student to know a lot of context or background information about a culture or a place or etc. Because what might end up happening is that they end up trying to make sense of that reference you're making instead of focusing on answering the question. So I'll give you an example, right? So this is something that I would avoid as a prompt. On January 1st, 1752, Betsy Ross was born. As you may know, she sewed the first American flag. If you were asked to create a new flag for the United States, what would it look like? Explain why you made your design choices. Okay. So the first part of this sentence, it goes into a lot of detail about Betsy Ross as a figure, about the timeline, the U.S., about the American, her role in creating the flag. If I was a English language learner, and I'm still at a basic literacy level, I might get too hung up on trying to make sense of that first part. Whereas you're trying to get from me a written response about my thoughts on creating a flag. Okay. And so here is a possible alternative to this. Okay. So I would create something like this. Flags are very important to the identity of a country. If you were asked to create a flag for the United States, what would it look like? And explain why you made your choice. Okay, so here you're quickly moving your student to the main part of this prompt, which is you want to see them talk about what they would put into a design for the American flag. Okay, and the first part of this, flags are very important to the identity of a country. It already gets them to start thinking about, oh yeah, country's identity is represented by a flag, and so if I'm trying to represent the identity of the U.S., this is what I would put into it. And so hopefully you can see in this second prompt that it's a little bit straightforward, and it doesn't require your student to necessarily get hung up on the historical reference or cultural reference. All right. A couple other things to keep in mind. Don't include too many questions in one prompt. All right? Keep prompts to one main question and maybe one follow-up questions, because the more questions you build into a prompt, the longer it gets and the more complicated it might be. And so you want to keep it to one question or two questions at a max. So for example, what is your favorite holiday and what makes it your favorite? Okay. If you're finding that your student struggles with a writing task, I sometimes like to give them a little nudge by just giving them a sentence starter. Okay, and so if we look back at that writing prompt that in the previous example here, what is your favorite holiday? What makes it your favorite? I would just give my students a sentence starter. My favorite holiday is, and then ask them to complete the sentence. I think this is my favorite holiday because, and then move forward. Now, again, obviously this all depends on your student's level, But if you're finding that your student is struggling, I've noticed that sentence starters really help to help them build some momentum. You can also give your students specific requirements in the prompt to further guide them. Okay, and so you give them a prompt, and then at the end you say, write at least 3 sentences describing your family, right? Or this can be your entire prompt. And so now they know, okay, my tutor is looking for 3 sentences. You can ask for more, you can ask for less, but sometimes I find this also helps. And then finally, always put yourself in the shoes of your student and try to write a response to a writing prompt that you created. So if it seems complicated to you, there's a good chance your student will find it complicated as well. I would say this is a really good takeaway piece of advice, because like I said, sometimes I'll create assignment prompts and I think it sounds great in my head and I think, oh man, my students will love this. And then I look at it and then I try to, think about how I would do this. And I realize I made this way too complicated. And so I would recommend the same thing to you. So if you come up with a prompt, try to write out your own response to it. And you find that you struggle with it a little bit, go back and modify that prompt. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about giving feedback on student writing. So there are many different approaches and schools of thought on how to best give feedback on student writing. But in this workshop, I want to cover one overarching concept to giving feedback as well as a specific method. And again, some of this information might have already been covered in your tutor training. So I apologize if this is things that you've already heard. Okay, so one overarching concept for providing feedback is you want to give your student a feedback sandwich. Okay, so I'll explain a little bit about what that means if you are unfamiliar, right? So a feedback sandwich is the idea that when you are responding to your students' writing, you don't want to just always point out you did this wrong or this needs to be corrected, but you want to sandwich that criticism between 2 levels of praise, right? And because there is a risk that if all you do is point out the errors, you're going to end up, your student's going to be less receptive to writing in the future, okay? So I'll give you an example of what a feedback sandwich would look like. And you can see I try to color code it to match the little visual so you can get a sense of what I mean. So an example here, great work answering that prompt correctly. You clearly understood the questions that were being asked. However, I noticed that you're leaving out a lot of articles in your writing. Words like a or the. For example, you need to add an A here and here. Overall, your spelling has improved a lot, and I'm seeing fewer spelling mistakes. Okay, so your students gets the criticism. They know they need to put more articles or not to leave out articles in the writing. But they also know that, hey, I did a great job. I answered the prompt correctly, and I'm also improving on my spelling. And so overall, I think this is a more comprehensive way of giving feedback to your student. Okay, so the feedback sandwich. And then one feedback method that I want to recommend is marking errors and then rewriting. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about how to transfer this over to an online format, but for this particular example, let's just imagine this in a face-to-face tutoring session, right? And so marking errors and then rewriting, what you would do is you would mark the errors in your student writing. So if it's spelling, if it's syntax, whatever it might be, you show your student where those errors are, right? And then you rewrite their response for them with the corrections in place. Okay, so that you as a tutor take what they wrote and you write it out with the correct spelling and with the correct syntax, all that. And then you ask them to look at your rewritten, you ask them to look at that and rewrite their corrected response. So the whole idea of this is you're building in as much repetition as possible. And again, not just repetition, but repetition with guided feedback. Okay, so for example, let's say you saw this sentence in one of your students' writing, right? Last month, I see a movie every Sundays. Okay, and so in this approach of, in this feedback method, right, you would mark, okay, here is, you misspelled month. You used the wrong tense for C. I apologize. So this should have also been highlighted. A movie every Sunday, right? And then you got to put a period in. And then you ask your student to then write that sentence, right? Write it, last month I saw a movie every Sunday. Okay, so in this, they see their mistake, they see the corrected version, and then they got to practice the corrected version. All right. Excuse me. So remember, one of the most important keys to improving our students' writing is not just repetition and practice, but repetition plus guided feedback. Okay. All right. And so to wrap this up, I want to talk about a sample writing activity for an online tutoring session. Okay, so teaching writing online can pose a number of challenges, especially when it comes to interaction and giving feedback. However, we can utilize the chat feature that comes with nearly every kind of online meeting platform to somewhat get around those challenges. So the following activity will take a good amount of time to execute. So make sure you set aside an adequate amount of time during your tutoring session. Okay, so this activity that I'll describe, whether you use Zoom or Skype or Google Meet, whatever it might be, I'm pretty sure a lot of these online meeting platforms all have a chat feature. Okay, so for this activity, you want to make sure you are familiar with that chat feature and how to use it, and that your student is familiar with it as well. And the second thing I want to talk about is just that this activity is going to take a lot of back and forth and take some time. So I would say don't try to rush this process. And I would say as an overall concept, writing should not be an activity that is rushed. Okay, so let's say you're in an online meeting with your student and you want them to practice their writing. Okay, so the first thing I would do is I would, in the chat feature, I would type or copy and paste the prompt you want your student to answer. So let's see if I can demonstrate this in real time here. Give me 1 second. Oh, I see the chat. All right. Lynn, I see your question, and so I'll answer that in a moment, right? But so I'll just give you a real live demonstration of this, right? So in the chat feature, I would type to my student the prompt, right? So I would say, what is your favorite meal of the day? And then so first I would, and then I would read it to him. I would say, what is your favorite meal of the day? You may also want to provide some sentence starters and give them a time limit. So I'll say, start with this. My favorite meal of the day is, okay. Then I'll say, write at least 3 sentences. So if you have the chat function open on Zoom right now, you'll be able to see that I'm typing in what I'm talking about in the PowerPoint. If you can't see it, that's okay. All right. So after you've typed this in, you're going to ask them to write out their response in their journal or on a piece of paper. Okay, so something that's off screen. Don't ask them to type into the chat window right away. Tell them, I want you to write this on a piece of paper. During this time, you should also answer your own prompt. This will help pass the time so that you are not just sitting there as your student writes. In addition, you can also share out your response later with the student. Okay, so as they're working to answer their question, their favorite meal of the day, you can also answer your own prompt as well. Don't be afraid of the silence. That's why I always tell some of my colleagues who are just beginning teaching for the first time. I say, don't be worried about a silence between you and the student, because that means they're working. That means they're thinking. Okay. Once they are done, right? So once they are done writing their response to your prompt out on a separate piece of paper, ask them to type it out, the response in the chat window, exactly how they wrote it in their journal, right? So I would say, okay, look at what you wrote and type it out in your chat window. Now, depending on your students' abilities with their familiarity with computers, they might not be the fastest typist. And so this is what I meant when I said this activity might take some time, right? They might just take a while to punch it in, right? And that's totally fine, because you ultimately need to see what they wrote. So however much time it takes, that's totally fine. Okay, so this will allow you to directly see their writing as well as serve as another round of practice for their student, right? So your student already had a round of practice writing on the paper. Now they get to practice it one more time, typing it into the chat window. I would encourage my student. I would say, don't try to correct yourself in the middle. Like, show me exactly what you wrote on the piece of paper. All right. And then I would read their typed out response while providing feedback using the feedback sandwich. Okay, so I would read their response, and afterwards I would say, oh, okay, great job doing this. However, you need to be sure about this, so we want to use that feedback sandwich technique. Then what you would do is you would type out the corrected version of the response back to the student so that they can see what it looks like. Okay, so remember, it's important that your students see exactly what their correct response would have been. And again, you want to take your time with this. Okay, and then have them either rewrite the corrected response by hand or via the chat window, right? This is your choice, right? Maybe you want visual confirmation that they are writing out the correct response. Okay, if that's the case, then you want them to type it into the chat window. Or maybe you want them to just keep track of their writing. So you can say, okay, now write the correct response underneath your own response so that you can create it. Phyllis, I'm going to get to your question in one moment. Yep. All right. At the end of your tutoring session, make sure you copy and paste all the text in the chat log or the chat window into a separate Word document. You can send this to your student later on or keep it as part of your collected material. So this is not a requirement, but this is a recommendation. I'm one of those teachers that I keep hold of everything that my students write and all their work. And so if you want to also just keep track and keep an archive of their work, I recommend doing this. This isn't something that's directly related to this activity, but you may also want to ask your student to dedicate part of their journal to an error log so that they can track what their patterns are, right? So if you notice that your students have been consistently, let's say, misspelling a word, right? Maybe they're misspelling phone, right? They're not quite getting a hang of the PH equals F sound. So you would have an error log. You would, every time they make a mistake with the PH spelling, you would just say, hey, make sure you put that in your log so that they have this tracking list of their errors, and that will help them notice that error and the pattern of that error a little bit better. And then finally, I want to wrap up this workshop by just reminding everyone, right? Writing is a slow and sometimes frustrating process. You might encounter your students getting frustrated, but be patient with your student and don't be afraid to take your time, right? Don't be afraid to take your time in letting them write a response out. Don't be afraid to take your time in giving them feedback. You want to make sure that they have time to think things out. You want to make sure they have time to process the correct information, and that you also want to give yourself time to make sure you're giving the correct feedback to them. Okay. So that's the end of my workshop. I want to take a look at these two questions. Okay, I'm going to start with Phyllis first. So Phyllis asked, we use the whiteboard for many of our activities. Would this work well for the journal? Yeah, I think this would work well for the journal. The thing about the journal is it's meant to be much more of an individual resource, right? It's a resource that your student can work with and review and look at when they're not around you and when they're not around the whiteboard. So any activity that you want them to, maybe if they have time to practice or review or maybe just do on their own, I would move that to the journal. Yeah. Let's see. And then Lynn asked, both of my students want to improve their listening skills, so I've not worked on writing. Perhaps I could give them a question to answer each week. What do you think? And how is this best handled? Yeah, I think the idea of a prompt definitely transfers over very well to listening. If you look on that list provided in that link, all those prompts work well for listening, and all the philosophies I think to coming up with prompts, writing prompts, also apply to listening or speaking prompts. You want to keep it simple, no more than 2 questions. A descriptive prompt would ask your students to talk about or describe something verbally. A reflective prompt would ask them to give you some follow-up details. So absolutely. So I think all the concepts that we covered about prompts in this workshop transfers over very well to listening skills as well. Can you provide a list of things in writing that we can praise for the feedback sandwich? Yeah. I think one of the main things to focus on, or one of the easiest things to focus on in terms of giving praise is, did my student answer the prompt correctly? Like, did they understand the prompt? Okay. If they understood the prompt and they hit every question, even if they spelled everything in the response incorrectly, but you can tell that they understood your prompt and your questions, that's a huge, I think that's definitely something to build off of, right? Because you may not realize it, but when you see a prompt, there's this process of thinking about how do I write it out, right? And that process in the middle is very different than thinking about how do you respond to it verbally. So the fact that your student can look at a prompt and already make that mental process of moving over to how do I write out a response, if they're able to do that, I think it's already something worth praising. Other things worth praising, I think also just think back to things that your student has struggled with in the past in terms of English. And if you find that they maybe are fixing them or they're not making that mistake in their writing, let them know, right? Let's say, if they whatever improvements you see in their speaking and listening, and you also notice in their writing, let them know, right? Like, oh, I'm going to use articles again. Articles is something that for English language learners, I notice is something that they always stumble upon, right? The a and the. So if you're noticing your student catching those and putting those in, yeah, that's definitely something huge to build off upon. So I would say to answer that question, Dorn, one, if they understand the prompt, that's definitely something worth praising. If they're making improvements off of errors that they used to make, let them know and that they're making those improvements. Any other questions? Lori, do you think we can maybe unmute the mics and just in case if someone wants to verbally ask something?
I don't seem to. Okay, I tried to unmute some folks. I think they may have to unmute themselves.
Okay.
Some folks are unmuted. Roger, I was just going to add that I have used Google Docs, sort of the way that you use the chat feature, because both, if my student and I are meeting in Zoom, one of us can share the screen.
Yeah.
And the other one can go to the same Google Docs, and we can, do that kind of correction and read together. And then there's that record that we can reflect on the next week and build on.
Absolutely. So if you are comfortable and you are familiar with the Google Docs, I think that's a great tool like Lori was talking about. If you're not familiar, I would recommend checking out that link that I posted in the PowerPoint. I'll just go back to it right now. Give me a moment.
Roger, Irene speaking. Thank you. That was really nice and easy to follow through.
Oh, thank you, Irene. I appreciate
it was. That. I agree. Thank you.
I have another comment. When face-to-face was available to me, and I knew writing was always a reluctant activity, I would start the day with the paper and the pencil and have a conversation with my student and write, "Hi, how are you today?" Then write back, "I am feeling fine. Are you happy or sad today?" Something about the weather, a known thing. And just, that opening of the activity got them open to pencil and paper.
Absolutely.
Same thing can be done electronically, I see, where you just share a greeting in like a conversation. Yeah,
I think that's a great idea because a lot of, I don't know if this is a case for adult learners, but I know for a lot of college students, American college students, coming out of high school, they think about writing in purely essay form, right? When they think about writing, it's like a giant wall of text. But if you every day just get your students to write just a little bit, they stop thinking about writing as this huge, like every time I write, I have to sit down and write a paper. No, like you can sit down and write 2-3 sentences and slowly over time, you they just get more and more comfortable with doing these shorter and shorter tasks. And I do the same thing you do, Irene. At the beginning of every class I do, we start off with, I put a prompt up. I have my students write in their writing journal, and then we use that to kick off the lesson for the day, right? So I'll pick a prompt that is somehow related to the lesson. I'll give them 5 minutes to write. I'll just say, sometimes I'll ask for a paragraph. Sometimes I'll just say, write 2 to 3 sentences, just something to get us talking a little bit. Now, in your context, you want to make sure that your students are, not just scribbling down notes, right? You want them to actually practice the structure of a sentence. But the same, I think, philosophy applies. Just ask them to write 2 sentences starting out, and then use that as a jumping off point into the rest of your session.
I even use something in writing on a telephone interview I've been doing with a student, and she's going to have a job interview. So I said, well, let's take a minute, even though we're not seeing each other. Write your response. Why do you think we should do this kind of work in our business? It was a particular kind of business that she was trying to get a job. And so I said, write just a little bit about what you would say, and even use that as an approach to writing, and then read it to me. And then we had a talk, and we did pronunciate, and so I built on that.
Yeah. Irene, you should have taught this workshop. that was great. That's a great practice. Yeah.
So that's just using the technology, just the telephone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other question? Michelle, is that a question? Yeah.
Well, just a comment. I liked how you distinguished between descriptive writing and reflective writing, because my impetus with my student is to get her to write about what she's thinking about and feeling. And I got a little resistance on that. So now I can say to her, just describe something, and that it's less threatening. I realize I didn't realize what I was doing,
It's a great descriptive writing prompts are a great sort of entry for students who are resistant to writing, because it just feels less, I think, demanding, especially when you're starting out with writing. Yep.
Right. Yeah, that was good. Thank you for that.
Oh, thank you.
Roger, there's another question from Doran about how do you correct run-on sentences?
Yeah. Okay. So, sorry. All right. So, Doran says, my student is able to write lengthy responses, which can feel overwhelming to address the correction needed. Also, the sentence can consist of many run-on sentences. I need to know how to break it down. Yeah. So I think one way to control this is give your students first a limit, right? So if they're writing too much, just say you have 4 sentences or 3 sentences, right? And even if they can handle a paragraph, they can handle the length, but they can't quite handle the content quite yet, right? So you want to start them off, you can say, I know you can handle a paragraph, but I want to see you answer this in 3 sentences, okay? And if your students if there are too many run-on sentences, what I typically do to help students with run-on sentences is I literally draw like a line between where I think a run-on sentence should be split. And I'll tell them, like, I don't think, like, when I draw this line, I don't mean it's perfectly split here. It might be, but it might not always be. I'd say this, but here is where you need to separate your thought, okay? So everything before this line, make it into a sentence. And then everything after this line, make it into a sentence. And you might have to, tweak the words a little bit, but this is the line, right? And run-on sentences, it's just one of the things you gotta, and I feel like I'm beating a dead horse here, but it's just about, they have to write a lot, right? They have to write and read a lot to realize after a while, like, this sentence is much too long. I need to split this here. There isn't like a magic bullet that will help them see right away that it's a run-on sentence. Yeah. Phyllis says, can we have a copy of your PowerPoint? Yeah. Oh, there's a file feature. I'll do that in a moment. Yes. And then I just want to make sure I answer Michael's question too, because we're coming up to the end of the workshop. It seems that this process is best used during a session with immediate feedback rather than assigning homework and reviewing during the next session. Are there homework assignments that you can recommend to support the session lesson? Yeah, great question, Michael. I think, this lesson was definitely formatted to an online process, but I personally think that the idea of like giving a prompt, giving your student requirements, and then having them, and then correcting them and having to do it writing it correctly, I think you can stretch this out over homework, right? What you might want to do then, I think, is just give them more than one prompt, right? So like maybe 2 separate prompts. Like, here's a prompt where you have to write maybe a descriptive one, and you have 3 sentences. Here's a prompt where you have to do one that's more reflective based, and you get 4 sentences or 5 sentences for this. All right, so write it. Don't try to correct as you go along, but don't worry about that. Bring it back for the next time. You get to look at it. You then correct it in front of them. That's what I would say. Correct the homework right in front of them. Rewrite it for them in that session. Then say for this week's homework, rewrite my corrected responses, and then the next session you'll get to see that, thus confirming that they did it correctly. So it's basically just like stretching this activity out over a couple of sessions. Yeah. All right. So I'm going to try to go ahead and save this or share this file here. Give me one moment. If there are any other questions, feel free to shout them out. And also, sorry, Diane, go ahead.
I just sent it actually. My student just yesterday was asking me about the use of dashes in sentences.
Ooh,
and
okay.
He, first of all, is interested about how you speak them. Do I pause, which is fairly easy, but the use of dashes and say colons and their relative quality, and what do you recommend I say about that to him?
Yeah, I mean, okay. I would say, based on your experience with this student, do they have enough of a grasp on the English language to sort of, be able to execute and understand like colons and dashes and things like that? Or do you think they might be jumping too far ahead?
No, he does. He's actually an English speaker. He's not English as a second language. It's just he's a little behind in his knowledge.
Yeah, one simple way I would explain colons and dashes, I would say, is the information following a colon or a dash is typically information that builds upon what is before the colon and dash, right? And so, for example, you could say something like, I'm trying to think, like, here are the things I'm looking for at the store, colon. Fruit, bread, and rubber bands, something like that, right? And so everything after the colon, that list of stuff, is providing more details to what is stated before the colon. So I think that's, obviously there are nuances to that, but I would say that's a general philosophy, is that information that comes after the colon is typically building or providing more context or information for what is before the colon or the dash. And
dashes are used just as equally as colons then? I mean, that is kind of what I explained to him.
Yeah, they're rough. I would say they're roughly the same. I mean, the context will sort of gets a little bit more complicated when you dive in, but I think for his level, and that's just general rule, I think that's a safe one to practice.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I got 2 minutes left. I want to make sure I can share this. I can share this with PowerPoint with you all. There is a file button. I'm looking for.
It's down there in the chat.
It's in the chat. Yes. Yes, I see it. Thank you. I see it right now. I'm gonna upload the PowerPoint right now. Okay, so you should see it.
Yay.
Yeah. And I'll also share this with Lori, and maybe she can fire it out in an email or anything or something like that. But it will be available through that method as well if you want to get it another way.
Then everybody.
It's to everyone.
It.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I only sent it to Phyllis. Give me 1 second.
Then making sure everybody clicks it so it will.
Oh shoot. Sorry. I did it again. Here we go.
Change.
All right. This third time's the charm here.
There you go.
Here we go. All right.
So you just want to click on it to download it.
If you click on it, your computer should download it then.
Wow.
Yeah, beautiful.
Where are we looking to see it? I don't think.
In the chat window.
Yeah, I don't see it in there.
Scroll all the way down.
Oh, nope, I don't have it.
Let me see if I can send it. I'll just send it to Diane directly just to sort of, I'll try to see if we can circumvent this issue here. Oh, Oh, for some reason it's not popping up for Diane. I think there's something set in your chat that prevents you from receiving or getting files, because when I try to send it to you, I don't get that file icon that I got with Phyllis.
I have it, Roger, so I can just save it as a PDF and email it to Diane.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is there anybody else who is having trouble downloading it who wants it emailed?
Is that the prompt? Are those the prompts?
Not the, that was a PowerPoint, Irene.
Oh, the PowerPoint. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, Angela, I'll send it to you as well.
Yeah, like a copy. Thank you.
And it looks like Michael wants an email.
Oh,
as
Michael,
well.
okay. All right.
All right.
Thank you so much, Roger.
Oh,
Does
of course.
anybody have last minute
It's
questions?
been great.
If there are any other questions, I'll give Lori my email address to send it to everyone else. Feel free to email me anytime. So
Great.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Very good.
thank you all. All right, take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.